Can I play it for food?" They mocked the homeless veteran, their laughter echoing through the crystal chandeliers, not knowing the ragged man at their grand piano was about to shatter their world with a single song. When Walter Hayes, Medal of Honor recipient and forgotten piano legend, walked into that ballroom of millionaires, they saw only his torn army jacket and dirty boots. But sometimes the greatest lessons come from those we dismiss. Follow me to the end of this story and comment below which city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far Walter's tale has traveled. The Grand Legacy Ballroom stood like a crown jewel in the heart of Manhattan's Upper East Side, its Art Deco facade gleaming under the November moon. Inside, 500 of New York's wealthiest citizens mingled beneath chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes, their laughter bouncing off marble columns that had witnessed a century of privilege and power. Crystal champagne flutes clinked in perfectly manicured hands. Designer gowns worth tens of thousands swept across floors polished to mirror perfection. The air itself seemed to shimmer with wealth perfumed with exclusive fragrances and the subtle scent of money, that particular mixture of fine leather, expensive cologne, and absolute confidence that only the ultra-rich possessed. This was the annual Veterans Benefit Gala, though the irony wasn't lost on Emily Carter as she weaved between tables with her serving tray. Most of these people had never served anything but their own interests. They came for the networking, the photo opportunities, the chance to write off donations on their taxes while sipping champagne that cost more per bottle than a veteran's monthly disability check. Emily adjusted her black server's uniform, trying to ignore the ache in her feet from her 12-hour shift. At 23, she was working 3 jobs to pay for her nursing degree at Columbia, and nights like these reminded her exactly where she stood in the city's hierarchy. Invisible unless someone needed their glass refilled. Champagne, she offered to a cluster of men in tuxedos worth more than her annual tuition. Richard Thompson, the evening's host, and one of Manhattan's most ruthless real estate developers, barely glanced at her as he took a glass. At 55, Thompson had the kind of harsh, angular face that looked like it had been carved from granite and polished with ambition. His eyes cold and gray as winter steel surveyed the room like a general inspecting his troops. "The Veterans Support Center will be a crown jewel in our philanthropic portfolio," he was saying to his circle of sycophants. 20 million raised already, and the night's just beginning. Emily bit her tongue. She'd researched Thompson for a college paper on urban development. His companies had evicted dozens of veteran families from affordable housing to build luxury condos. The Veterans Support Center was less about helping heroes and more about laundering his reputation. A sudden gust of cold November air swept through the ballroom as the main doors opened. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Heads turned. The string quartet in the corner faltered for just a moment. A man stood in the doorway, and he didn't belong. Everything about him screamed outsider. His army jacket, olive drab and decades old, bore the faded patches of the 1st Infantry Division. His jeans were worn through at the knees, held up by a cracked leather belt that had seen better decades. His boots, old combat boots, left small traces of street dirt on the pristine marble with each step. But it was his face that made Emily's breath catch. He must have been in his 70s, with a gray beard that hadn't seen a barber in months, and hair that hung past his collar in silver-white waves. His skin bore the deep lines and weather-beaten texture of someone who'd spent years exposed to harsh elements. Yet his eyes, pale blue like winter sky, held something that made her pause. They weren't the vacant 1,000-yard stare she'd seen in some homeless veterans. These eyes were alive, alert, taking in every detail of the opulent room, with an expression she couldn't quite read. Security guards were already moving their hands, reaching for the discreet earpieces that would summon more muscle to remove this obvious intruder. But the man walked forward with surprising dignity, his back straight despite what must have been years of hardship. He moved like someone who had once commanded respect, even if the world had long since forgotten to give it. "Excuse me." His voice carried across the hushed ballroom, gravelly from disuse but with an underlying tone of cultured refinement that seemed at odds with his appearance. "I don't mean to intrude on your evening." Richard Thompson stepped forward, his face a mask of barely concealed disgust. "Sir, this is a private event. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The old man's gaze fixed on Thompson, and something flickered in those pale eyes. Recognition. Amusement. It was gone before Emily could identify it. "I understand," the man said, his voice steady. "I saw the signs about the veterans' benefit. I'm a veteran myself. 1st Infantry Vietnam, 68 to 71. A woman in a sequined gown that probably cost 6 figures actually stepped backward as if poverty might be contagious. Someone else pulled out their phone, likely to record the scene for their social media. Nothing like a little poverty porn to show how charitable they were by proximity. That's admirable." Thompson said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "But as I said, this is a ticketed event. $5,000 a plate. I'm sure you understand." "I do," the man replied. He gestured to the grand piano on the small stage at the far end of the ballroom. A Steinway Model D, its ebony surface gleaming under the spotlights. "I couldn't help but notice your piano. Beautiful instrument. Hamburg Steinway, if I'm not mistaken. 1963 or 64 from the soundboard's coloring." Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly. Few people could identify a piano's make and year from across a room. "I have a proposition," the old man continued. "I'm hungry. Haven't eaten in 2 days. Let me play something for your guests, and perhaps someone would be kind enough to buy me a meal. I promise I won't embarrass anyone." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, came a snicker. Then another. Within seconds, laughter rippled through the ballroom, not kind laughter, but the sharp, cutting sound of the privileged mocking the desperate. "He wants to play for food," someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Like a trained monkey," another voice added. "Someone call security before he contaminates something." Emily felt her stomach turn. She'd served these people for 3 years, smiled at their jokes, thanked them for their pitiful tips, but she'd never seen them quite this naked in their cruelty. Thompson held up a manicured hand, and the laughter died down. A smile played at the corners of his mouth, the smile of a cat that had just spotted a particularly entertaining mouse. "You know what?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Why not? Let's make this interesting." He pulled out his wallet, Hermes of course, and extracted a crisp $1,000 bill. "You play one song, just one, without making a fool of yourself, and I'll buy you dinner. Hell, if you can actually move anyone in this room to tears with your playing, this $1,000 is yours." The crowd murmured with excitement. This was better than the usual entertainment. This was Bloodsport Upper East Side style. "Richard, really?" murmured Abram Stevens, an elderly industrialist who'd actually served in Korea. "This isn't appropriate." "Oh, come now, Abram," Thompson replied. "We're here to support veterans, aren't we? Let's support this one. Besides," his smile turned predatory, "when's the last time any of us saw authentic desperation? It's practically performance art." The old man stood very still, his pale eyes moving from Thompson's smirking face to the eager crowd, to the piano waiting in the distance. Emily saw his hands at his sides, noticed the slight tremor in them. Hunger aged nerves. But then she looked closer and saw something else. His fingers were moving slightly unconsciously, as if playing an invisible keyboard. "I accept your terms," he said quietly. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as he walked toward the piano, their expressions ranging from amused to disgusted to morbidly curious. Someone was already taking bets on how quickly he'd humiliate himself. 20 says he doesn't even know how to open the lid properly. A young hedge fund manager laughed. 50 says he plays chopsticks and thinks he's Chopin, his companion replied. Emily found herself following her serving tray, forgotten. Something about this felt important, though she couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way he walked, not shuffling like someone broken by life, but with purpose, like a man approaching something sacred. The old man reached the piano and stopped. His weathered hand rested on the closed lid for a moment, and Emily could have sworn she saw him whisper something to it, like greeting an old friend. Then, with practiced ease that belied his appearance, he opened the keyboard cover and adjusted the bench height. Small movements that suggested an intimacy with the instrument that went beyond casual knowledge. He sat down and the room held its breath. The designer gowns stopped rustling. The champagne stopped flowing. Even the November wind outside seemed to pause. His fingers hovered over the keys, still trembling slightly. Emily noticed his eyes were closed, his face tilted up slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. The trembling in his hands increased, and for a horrible moment, she thought he might not be able to play at all. "Any time now, maestro," Thompson called out mockingly. "We don't have all night." The old man's eyes opened. He looked directly at Thompson, and this time Emily was certain she saw something in that gaze, not recognition, but purpose, decision. "My name," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, "is Walter Hayes, and this first piece was the last thing I played for my unit before our fire base was overrun in the Central Highlands. 13 men died that night. I've carried their names for 53 years. His fingers touched the keys. The first note rang out clear and true, a single B-flat that seemed to hang in the air like a question. Then another. Then a cascade of notes that Emily recognized as the opening to an old folk tune, Shenandoah. But not the simple version everyone knew. This was something else entirely, the melody wrapped in harmonies so complex and beautiful that it seemed impossible they were coming from just two hands. The trembling in his fingers was gone. In its place was a precision and power that transformed the raggedy old man into something else entirely. His hands moved across the keyboard with the kind of fluid grace that comes only from decades of practice, not just playing the notes, but pulling something from deep within the piano's soul. The melody grew building in layers. The left hand established a rhythm that somehow evoked both a river's flow and a soldier's march, while the right hand soared above it, turning the simple tune into something that spoke of loss, longing, and love for a home that might no longer exist. Emily realized she had tears on her cheeks. Around her, she could hear sharp intakes of breath, the rustle of people reaching for handkerchiefs. Even the servers had stopped moving, transfixed. But Walter wasn't done. Without pause, Shenandoah transformed the key, shifting the tempo, increasing. The folk melody became something else, Chopin's revolutionary etude, but played with a ferocity that the composer himself might have envied. His left hand attacked the keys with rapid-fire passages that should have been impossible for someone his age, while his right hand sang out the melody like a battle cry. It was technical mastery of the highest order, but it was more than that. It was the sound of revolution, of uprising, of every underdog who had ever stood up to power. In that moment, the shabby veteran at the piano wasn't asking for food, he was declaring war on everyone who had laughed at him. The etude reached its climax, and just when Emily thought the piano might actually break under the assault, the music shifted again. The storm clouds parted, and what emerged was Debussy's Clair de Lune, moonlight, after battle, peace after war, but a peace tinged with the memory of what had been lost. Walter's touch on the keys became so gentle, it was barely there yet. Every note rang clear. His eyes were closed again, and tears ran down his weathered cheeks into his gray beard, but his hands never faltered. If anything, the emotional weight he was carrying seemed to fuel the performance, adding layers of meaning to every phrase. The ballroom had become a cathedral, and Walter Hayes was both priest and congregation, offering up something that transcended mere performance. This was testimony. This was witness. This was 50 years of carrying the dead transformed into something beautiful enough to honor them. As the last notes of Clair de Lune faded into silence, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The 500 richest people in Manhattan had been struck dumb by a homeless veteran they'd tried to humiliate. Abram Stevens was the first to stand. The elderly industrialist who'd built an empire worth billions, who dined with presidents and kings, stood with tears streaming down his face and began to clap. The sound echoed through the ballroom like gunfire. Then Emily stood, her hands coming together so hard they hurt. Then another person. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet, the applause thunderous, overwhelming, unstoppable. Everyone except Richard Thompson. The real estate mogul remained seated, his face pale, his gray eyes fixed on Walter with an expression of growing horror. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly, his knuckles had turned white. Walter stood slowly, his dignity intact despite his ragged appearance. He turned to face the crowd, and Emily saw him scanning the faces, not with triumph, but with something like sadness. "Mr. Thompson," Walter said, his voice carrying over the dying applause, "I believe you owe me dinner." And he gestured to the tears still visible on many faces, $1,000. Thompson's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Someone in the crowd laughed, nervous, uncertain. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. The beggar was supposed to humiliate himself, not them. "Actually," Walter continued, "I'll make you another proposition. Keep your money. Keep your meal. But let me tell you all a story. A true story. About a young pianist who went to war and what he learned about the true value of things. About how he became successful beyond his wildest dreams and how he lost everything that mattered. About how he chose to disappear and why he chose tonight to reappear." He paused, those pale blue eyes sweeping the crowd again. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, you've been played. Oh, not just the piano, though, I hope you enjoyed that. You've been played in a much grander sense, because I'm not exactly who you think I am. And more importantly," his gaze fixed on Thompson again, "neither is your host." Thompson stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Security." But the security guard seemed frozen, as captivated as everyone else. Walter reached into his jacket, that shabby, worn army jacket, and pulled out an envelope. It was yellowed with age, sealed with wax. "This letter," he said, "was written by me 40 years ago, with instructions that it be opened tonight at this exact event. You see, I knew this night would come. I've been planning it for a very long time." "You're insane," Thompson snarled, but his voice cracked. "Am I?" Walter asked mildly. "Abram, you recognize my playing, don't you? You heard it once before at a USO show in 1969. You were a young lieutenant then. You requested Clair de Lune for your wife back home." Abram Stevens gasped. "My God, but you're supposed to be dead. They said you died in the Tet Offensive." "Who is he?" someone whispered urgently. Walter smiled, then the first real smile Emily had seen from him. It transformed his face, and suddenly she could see the young man. He must have been handsome and vital and full of promise. "My full name," he said, "is Walter Martin Hayes. Some of you older folks might remember me by another name, the pianist of Firebase Alpha. I was 22 when I was drafted fresh out of Juilliard with a recording contract waiting. Instead of concert halls, I played for soldiers. Instead of recording studios, I played in bunkers while mortars fell around us." He moved back to the piano, his hand resting on it like touching an old friend. "The night our firebase was overrun, I was playing this very kind of music for my brothers. 13 of them died defending our position. I survived because they put their bodies between me and the enemy. Can you imagine dying to save someone whose only weapon was music?" The ballroom was silent, except for the sound of muffled sobs. "I came home with a Medal of Honor I didn't want, and survivor's guilt that nearly killed me. But I also came home with their dying wishes. Private Rodriguez wanted his son to go to college. Sergeant Johnson wanted his daughter to have piano lessons. Lieutenant Morrison wanted his widow to never worry about money again." Walter's voice grew stronger. "So I did what I knew how to do. I played. I recorded. I composed. And every penny that didn't go to basic survival went to those 13 families. Then to other veterans' families. Then to more and more." He pulled out another piece of paper, this one crisp and new. "According to this document prepared by my attorneys at Baker McKenzie and Associates, the Walter Hayes Foundation has over the past 40 years distributed approximately $378 million to veterans' causes. It has put 9,000 children through college. It has prevented over 3,000 foreclosures on veterans' homes. It has funded medical treatments, psychiatric care, job training, and yes, music lessons for those who wanted them." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone was frantically Googling on their phone. "It's true," they announced. "The Walter Hayes Foundation. Oh my God, it's all true. But it says Walter Hayes died in 1985. "A convenient fiction," Walter said. "Hard to live a simple life when everyone knows you have money." So Walter Hayes, the philanthropist, died in a plane crash that never happened, and I became just another homeless veteran. I've been living on the streets for 15 years now, watching, listening, learning who really cares about veterans and who just uses us for photo opportunities." His gaze fixed on Thompson again, and this time there was steel in it. "Which brings us to you, Mr. Thompson. You see, I know about the Riverside Veterans Home you had demolished. I know about the 43 veteran families you evicted from the Bronx building. I know about the kickbacks from the city contracts for veteran housing that somehow never got built." Thompson's face had gone from pale to bright red. "You can't prove any of that. My lawyers will—" "Your lawyers are actually quite good," Walter interrupted. "But not as good as mine, and certainly not as good as the FBI's forensic accountants who've been investigating you for the past 3 years based on evidence I've been providing them." The sound Thompson made was barely human. He lunged forward, whether to attack Walter or flee Emily couldn't tell, but Abram Stevens and 2 other men caught him, held him. "Oh, one more thing," Walter said, reaching into his jacket again. This time he pulled out a leather wallet, thin, worn, but unmistakably expensive. From it he extracted a black credit card. "American Express Centurion. No limit. The homeless veteran you wanted to humiliate could have bought this entire building." He walked over to Emily, who stood frozen in shock with everyone else. "You were kind," he said softly. "I watched you. You were the only one who looked at me with genuine concern, not disgust or amusement." "What's your name?" "Emily," she managed. "Emily Carter." "What do you do, Emily, besides serve champagne to people who don't deserve your respect?" I'm in nursing school, Columbia." Walter smiled. Good. We need more healers. He pressed something into her hand. That's my real business card. Call the number tomorrow. Your tuition is covered, all of it. Books, living expenses, everything. And when you graduate the Veterans Support Center, the real one, not Thompson's money laundering scheme, will have a position waiting for you. Emily looked down at the card in her hand, then back up at Walter, tears streaming down her face. Why? Because kindness should be rewarded, he said simply. And because one of those 13 men who died saving me had a daughter who wanted to be a nurse. She never got the chance, died of cancer at 19, because they couldn't afford treatment. Every nurse I help graduate is a small payment on a debt I can never fully repay. He turned back to the crowd standing in the center of the ballroom, like a conductor before an orchestra. Ladies and gentlemen, I played for you tonight, not for food, not for money, but to teach a lesson. You look at a person's clothes, their appearance, their circumstances, and you think you know their worth. You're wrong. That server you ignored might be the next breakthrough surgeon. That janitor you walk past could be a poet whose words would change your life. That homeless veteran you mock might just be the one person keeping thousands of other veterans alive through anonymous donations. He moved back toward the piano, paused. Mr. Thompson will be leaving now. The FBI agents waiting outside have questions for him. As for the Veterans Support Center, it will be built, but not by him. Mr. Stevens, if you're willing, I'd like you to head the project. I'll provide the initial funding, $50 million to start. Abram Stevens, still visibly shaken, nodded. It would be an honor. Good. Walter sat back down at the piano. Now, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to play one more piece. This one's for the 13 who didn't come home, and for all the others still fighting their wars long after the shooting stopped. His fingers found the keys again, and this time the music was something none of them had heard before. It was Walter's own composition, written in the dark hours when survivor's guilt threatened to consume him. It was sorrow and rage, love and loss, despair and hope, all woven together into something that transcended mere notes on a page. Emily closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. In it, she could hear helicopters and rain, laughter and screaming, promises made and promises kept. She could hear the story of a young man who went to war with music in his heart and came back with ghosts in his soul, who turned his pain into purpose and his guilt into grace. When the last note faded, Walter stood one final time. The ballroom was completely silent. No applause this time, just a respectful, almost reverent quiet. Thank you for listening, he said simply. Really listening, perhaps for the first time. He walked toward the door, his shabby clothes and worn boots no longer a mark of shame but a chosen uniform, a reminder that worth isn't measured in thread counts or bank accounts. Mr. Hayes, Emily called out. Walter, will we see you again? He paused at the door, looked back with those pale blue eyes that had seen too much, but somehow still held hope. Perhaps, he said. I still have work to do. There are other Richard Thompsons out there, other ballrooms full of people who've forgotten what really matters. But tonight, he smiled, tonight was a good start. He walked out into the November night, leaving behind a ballroom full of people who would never look at a homeless person the same way again. The security guards made no move to stop him. Someone started to clap slowly, respectfully, and others joined in, but Walter was already gone, disappeared into the city like a ghost. Emily looked down at the business card in her hand. It was simple, elegant Walter Hayes Foundation and a phone number. On the back, in handwritten script, the world needs more people who see with their hearts. Don't ever lose that. She tucked it carefully into her pocket and went back to work serving champagne to people who suddenly seemed smaller, less significant than they had an hour ago. The conversations had resumed, but they were different now, subdued, thoughtful. She heard fragments as she passed. "I had no idea. We should do more. I've been such a fool." At the piano, Abram Stevens stood with several others already making plans for the Real Veterans Support Center. Thompson's empty chair seemed to loom large, a reminder of how wrong they'd all been about who deserved respect and who didn't. As the evening wore on, Emily found herself thinking about Walter Hayes, the pianist of Firebase Alpha, the ghost who'd haunted New York streets for 15 years, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to deliver his message. She wondered how many other Walter Hayes were out there, hidden heroes, dismissed and discarded by a society that measured worth in all the wrong ways. Her shift ended at midnight. As she changed out of her server's uniform in the staff room, her supervisor approached. "Emily about tonight?" "Yes. That was extraordinary. Did he really give you his card?" She nodded. "You're going to call them first thing tomorrow." Her supervisor, a bitter woman who usually delighted in making the servers' lives miserable, was quiet for a moment. Then, "My brother came back from Afghanistan different. PTSD. He's been on the streets for 2 years. I've tried to help, but..." She trailed off. "Do you think the foundation might..." Emily pulled out the card, copied the number on a piece of paper. "Call them. Tell them Walter Hayes said the world needs more people who see with their hearts." As she left the grand Legacy Ballroom and stepped into the cold November night, Emily looked up at the stars, barely visible through the city's glow. Somewhere out there, Walter Hayes was walking the streets he'd called home for 15 years. But tonight, something had shifted. Tonight, in a ballroom full of millionaires, a homeless veteran had reminded them all what real wealth looked like. She pulled her coat tighter and headed for the subway, the business card safe in her pocket, her entire future changed by a man who'd asked to play piano for food and instead had fed their souls. The city hummed around her traffic sirens, the endless rhythm of 8 million lives intersecting. But underneath it all, she could still hear Walter's music, that final composition that had seemed to hold entire lifetimes in its measures, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would never forget this night. None of them would. The ghost in the ballroom had made sure of that. The November wind carried the echoes of Walter's music through the streets of Manhattan as Emily made her way home, but she wasn't the only one who couldn't sleep that night. In a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Abram Stevens stood at his window, a glass of scotch untouched in his hand, staring out at the city lights, while his mind traveled back 55 years to a muddy USO tent in Vietnam, where a young pianist had played Clair de Lune just for him. He'd written to his wife about that moment, told her how the music had made him feel human again in the middle of all that death. And now, all these decades later, to discover that the same pianist had been living on the streets, watching them all, judging their worthiness. It shook something fundamental in Abram's understanding of the world. His phone had been ringing non-stop since the gala. Board members, investors, reporters who'd somehow already caught wind of the story. But Abram ignored them all. Instead, he pulled out a different phone one few people had the number for, and made a call he should have made years ago. "Sarah, it's Abram Stevens. I know it's late, but I need you to pull everything we have on veterans housing in the 5 boroughs. Every shelter, every program, every single bed. And Sarah, clear my schedule for tomorrow. All of it." Meanwhile, in a very different part of the city, Richard Thompson sat in a federal holding cell, his $5,000 tuxedo wrinkled and stained with sweat. The FBI agents had been polite, professional, and absolutely devastating in their precision. They had everything: documents, recordings, a paper trail going back 15 years. And at the center of it all, like a ghost haunting his destruction, was Walter Hayes. "Your lawyer's here," the guard announced. Marcus Webb, senior partner at Webb Crenshaw and Associates, looked like he'd been dragged from bed, which he had. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his expression grim. "Richard, they have everything. Every kickback, every diverted fund, every falsified document. Someone's been feeding them information for years, someone with intimate knowledge of your operations. Hayes," Thompson spat the name like a curse. "Walter Hayes is dead," Marcus said carefully. "He died in 1985. The FBI's sources are confidential. Don't be naive, Marcus. That man tonight, that homeless veteran that was Walter Hayes, he's been planning this for years, decades maybe. Living on the streets, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy me." Marcus set down his briefcase with a sharp click. "Richard, listen to yourself. You're talking about conspiracy theories. The judge isn't going to care about some elaborate revenge plot. What matters is that they have evidence of you embezzling $37 million meant for veterans' housing." "He played us," Thompson said, his voice hollow. "He played that piano, and he played every single one of us. Do you know what the worst part is, Marcus? I actually laughed at him. I offered him $1,000 like he was a performing monkey. And the whole time he had hundreds of millions. The whole time he was the one pulling the strings." Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying his client. "The federal prosecutor is offering a deal. Full cooperation testimony about your co-conspirators, and you might get 10 years instead of 30. Thompson's laugh was bitter. "Co-conspirators, you mean the other people at that gala who knew exactly what I was doing and didn't care as long as their portfolios grew, the ones who are probably right now scrambling to distance themselves from me." "Richard, get out. Marcus, just go. Send someone else tomorrow. I can't look at another person in a $1,000 suit right now without seeing that old man's eyes." As his lawyer left, Thompson slumped on the narrow bench of his cell. Somewhere in the city, Walter Hayes was probably settling into whatever cardboard box or shelter he called home, and Thompson couldn't decide what was worse, that he'd been brought down by a homeless veteran, or that the homeless veteran had chosen to be homeless just to catch people like him. The next morning brought a crisp clarity to the city, as if the previous night's revelations had somehow cleaned the air itself. Emily arrived at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital for her morning shift at 6:30, her eyes heavy from lack of sleep but her mind racing. She'd called the number on Walter's card at exactly 9 a.m. as soon as the Foundation's offices opened. The woman who answered had been expecting her call. "Miss Carter, Mr. Hayes told us you'd be reaching out. We have all your information already. Your remaining tuition, $67,000, will be paid in full by the end of the week. We're also setting up a monthly stipend for your living expenses. $3,000 should cover rent and necessities. Is that sufficient?" Emily had nearly dropped the phone. That's more than sufficient. That's incredible. I don't know what to say. Mr. Hayes also wanted me to tell you that there's a position waiting for you at the Veterans Support Center when you graduate. But he stressed that you should feel no obligation. The gift is unconditional." Now working her rounds at the hospital, Emily found herself seeing the patients differently. That elderly man in room 302 with the persistent cough, was he a veteran? Had he served his country only to be forgotten by it? The middle-aged woman with diabetes in 318 who couldn't afford insulin. What was her story? "Carter, you're needed in the ER," her supervisor called out. Emily hurried down, expecting the usual chaos of a New York emergency room. What she found instead made her stop in her tracks. There on a gurney lay Walter Hayes. He was conscious but pale, his breathing labored. An oxygen mask covered his face and the monitors showed an irregular heartbeat. but his pale blue eyes were alert, and when he saw Emily, they crinkled at the corners in what might have been a smile. "Mr. Hayes!" Emily rushed to his side. "What happened?" Dr. Morrison, the attending physician, looked up from Walter's chart. "Found collapsed on a bench in Riverside Park. Elderly homeless man, severe malnutrition, pneumonia, and what looks like the beginning stages of congestive heart failure. He needs to be admitted, but he's refusing treatment. Says he just needs to rest a bit, and he'll be on his way." Emily looked at Walter in disbelief. "You're refusing treatment. You could die." Walter pulled the oxygen mask down slightly, his voice weak but clear. "Been dying for years, young lady. Just slower than the 13 who saved me." "Dr. Morrison," Emily said urgently, "this is Walter Hayes, the Walter Hayes, from the Hayes Foundation. He's not just some homeless—" "I'm exactly that," Walter interrupted, his voice firm, despite its weakness. "A homeless veteran who needs a bed someone else could use better. There are younger men out there, men who still have fighting years left in them." Dr. Morrison's eyes widened. "Walter Hayes, but you're supposed to be dead, yes. I get that a lot lately." Walter managed a dry chuckle that turned into a cough. "Apparently, I'm not very good at it." "Mr. Hayes," Dr. Morrison said, his entire demeanor changing, "regardless of who you are, you need treatment. That pneumonia alone could kill you and your heart." "My heart gave out a long time ago, doctor. The thing beating in my chest is just marking time." Emily grabbed his hand, surprised by how cold it was. "Please, you just changed my life. You changed hundreds of lives last night. Let us help you now." Walter studied her face for a long moment. "You know what the irony is? I have the best health insurance money can buy. Private doctors who would helicopter in to treat me. But for 15 years, I've watched veterans die in emergency rooms because they couldn't afford an aspirin. Why should I be different?" "Because you can do more good alive than dead," a new voice said from the doorway. Abram Stevens entered looking like he hadn't slept. He was carrying a box of files and had the determined expression of a man on a mission. "Abram," Walter said with mild surprise, "how did you—" "I've had people looking for you all night. Every shelter, every street corner. When the hospital called about a homeless veteran matching your description, I came immediately." "You had no right." "I had every right," Abram interrupted. "You saved my life in 1969. Not physically, but that music, that moment of beauty in all that ugliness, it kept me human. It reminded me what I was fighting to get back to. I've owed you a debt for 55 years, and I'll be damned if I let you die on a gurney in an emergency room." Walter was quiet for a moment, his labored breathing the only sound. "Besides," Abram continued, pulling up a chair, "we have work to do. The Veterans Support Center isn't going to build itself. I've been going through the plans Thompson had drawn up, and they're all wrong. Luxury appointments, marble bathrooms, a boardroom bigger than the actual treatment areas. We need to start from scratch, and I need your input." "I'm tired, Abram." "Then rest. But rest in a proper bed with proper treatment. Emily here can be your private nurse when she's not in classes. I'll cover the additional cost." "Mr. Stevens," Emily started. "I couldn't." "You can and you will," Abram said firmly. "Consider it part of your education. Walter has 50 years of stories about veterans' needs. That knowledge needs to be preserved, passed on." Walter looked between them, these two people who'd been strangers 24 hours ago and were now fighting for his life. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "Not a chance," Abram and Emily said in unison. For the first time since Emily had met him, Walter Hayes laughed, really laughed. Not the bitter chuckle of last night, or the dry humor of moments ago, but genuine warm laughter that seemed to take years off his weathered face. "All right," he said finally. "But conditions. I get a regular room, not some VIP suite. I want to be where the other veterans are. And Emily, you keep working your regular shifts. Your education comes first always. The debt I carry wouldn't forgive me if I interfered with that." As Dr. Morrison called for orderlies to move Walter to a room, Emily felt her phone buzz. It was a news alert. Homeless veteran revealed as secret philanthropist, shocks New York elite. The story was everywhere: CNN, Fox, The Times, The Post. Someone at the gala had recorded Walter's performance and his revelation, and the video had already been viewed 3 million times. But the real story, Emily thought as she watched Abram help settle Walter into his hospital bed, wasn't the money or the revelation, or even Thompson's arrest. It was this, the slow, patient work of rebuilding connections, of seeing worth where others saw nothing, of choosing to keep fighting even when the war had taken everything from you. Over the next 3 days, Walter's hospital room became something of a pilgrimage site. Veterans from across the city came to pay their respects, many with their own stories of mysterious help that had arrived just when they needed it most. A mortgage payment that had been anonymously paid. A child's cancer treatment mysteriously covered. A job opportunity that had appeared out of nowhere. "It was you, wasn't it?" asked Jerome Washington, a Gulf War veteran who'd lost his legs to an IED. "5 years ago, when I was about to lose my house, someone paid off the entire mortgage. The bank said it was an anonymous donation, but it was you." Walter, looking better after 3 days of IV antibiotics and proper nutrition, neither confirmed nor denied. "Sometimes good things just happen, Jerome." "Bullshit," Jerome said with a grin. "My wife had written a letter to the VA about our situation. Someone intercepted it, someone who knew the VA wouldn't do anything fast enough, that someone had been watching, waiting, ready to help." More stories emerged. Dozens, then hundreds. The Walter Hayes Foundation's official records showed millions in donations, but the unofficial tally, the cash left in mailboxes, the bills paid directly to creditors, the anonymous scholarships suggested something far greater. "How?" Emily asked one evening after her shift. She'd taken to spending her dinner breaks in Walter's room listening to his stories. "How did you manage all of it?" "Compound interest is a wonderful thing," Walter said. "That recording contract I had before the war, I took it when I got back. 1 album, songs from Firebase Alpha. It went platinum. Every penny went into investments. IBM in the 70s, Apple in the 80s, Amazon in the 90s. When you don't spend anything on yourself, when you live on the streets and eat at soup kitchens, money grows faster than you'd imagine." "But how did you know who needed help?" Walter's eyes grew distant. "You learn to see the signs. The way a man holds his shoulders when he's carrying more than he can bear. The look in a woman's eyes when she's choosing between feeding her children and paying rent. After a while, you don't even need to look. You can feel it like a frequency only certain people can hear. The frequency of desperation," Emily said softly. "The frequency of need," Walter corrected. "Desperation is just the volume turned up too loud." On the 4th day, an unexpected visitor arrived. Margaret Thompson, Richard's wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, according to the divorce papers she'd filed that morning. She was a small woman in her 60s, expensively dressed, but with a haunted look that suggested recent revelations had shattered more than just her marriage. "Mr. Hayes," she said, standing uncertainly in the doorway. "I'm Margaret Thompson. I wanted to apologize." "You have nothing to apologize for," Walter said kindly. "I do, though. I knew. Not the specifics, not the crimes, but I knew Richard was cruel. I knew he took pleasure in stepping on people he saw as beneath him. And I did nothing. I enjoyed the lifestyle his cruelty bought me. She pulled out a checkbook. I want to donate to the Veterans Support Center. $5 million. It's my personal inheritance from my father, money Richard never touched. Walter studied her for a long moment. Why? Because my father was a veteran. Korean War. He died when I was young, but I remember him waking up screaming. I remember my mother holding him while he cried. I remember him saying once that the only thing that kept him sane was knowing that people back home cared, that his sacrifice meant something. She paused, tears rolling down her carefully made-up face. I dishonored his memory by marrying Richard, by choosing comfort over conscience. This doesn't make up for it, but it's a start. We all make choices we regret, Walter said gently. The question is what we do once we realize we've chosen wrong. Margaret nodded, wiped her tears, and turned to Abram. Mr. Stevens, I also want to volunteer. I have a degree in social work I've never used. If you need help at the center, I want to be part of it. After she left, Abram shook his head in amazement. You've started something, Walter. It's like the whole city suddenly woke up to what's been in front of them all along. But Walter wasn't listening. He was staring at the window at the setting sun painting the city gold, and Emily could see his fingers moving slightly, playing an invisible piano. What are you playing? She asked. A new piece, he said. Something I've been composing for 50 years but could never finish. I think I finally know how it ends. That night Emily was awakened by her phone ringing. It was the hospital. Walter had taken a turn for the worse. His heart, already weak, was failing rapidly. She ran the 20 blocks to the hospital, arriving to find Abram already there, along with Dr. Morrison, and a growing crowd of veterans who'd somehow heard the news. He's asking for you, Dr. Morrison told Emily. Walter was awake but clearly struggling. The monitors showed his heart rhythm becoming increasingly erratic. Emily, he said weakly, I need you to do something for me. Anything. In my jacket pocket, the one I was wearing when I came in, there's a key. Locker 1847 at Grand Central. Everything's there. The real records. The names of everyone I've helped, everyone I couldn't help. The music I wrote but never shared. Make sure it goes to the right people. You can give it to them yourself, Emily said, gripping his hand. You're going to be fine. Walter smiled sadly. We both know that's not true, but it's all right. I've been running on borrowed time since 1969. Every day since then has been a gift I didn't deserve. Don't say that. Listen to me. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. What I said at the gala about character being the true measure of worth. I need you to remember that. You're going to see things in your career, terrible things, unfair things. You're going to want to become cynical to protect yourself by caring less. Don't. The moment you stop seeing the person beneath the circumstances, you become like them, like the people who laughed at me last night. The room had filled with people, now veterans, hospital staff, even some reporters who'd been staking out the hospital. But Walter only had eyes for Emily and Abram. Abram the center. Build it right. Not a monument to charity, but a place of dignity, where a veteran can get help without feeling like they're begging. Promise me. I promise. Abram said, his voice thick with emotion. Walter's breathing became more labored. Dr. Morrison moved closer, but Walter waved him off. One more thing, he gasped. The piano at the gala, buy it. Put it in the center. Let anyone who wants to play it. Music. Music heals things medicine can't touch. His eyes began to flutter closed, but then they snapped open, urgent and clear. The 13, he said, though no one was sure who he was talking to. I can see them. They're waiting. They're... A smile spread across his face, peaceful and profound. They're applauding. Walter Martin Hayes, the pianist of Firebase alpha philanthropist ghost of New York's streets, closed his eyes for the last time at 3:47 a.m. on a cold November morning, surrounded by people who'd learned too late just how extraordinary he was. But his heart monitor didn't flatline immediately. For 17 more seconds, exactly the time it takes to play the opening bars of Clair de Lune, it beat in a rhythm that sounded almost like music. The silence that followed Walter's passing seemed to extend beyond the hospital room, as if the entire city had paused to acknowledge the loss of someone most hadn't even known existed until a week ago. Emily stood frozen still, holding his hand, feeling the warmth slowly fade from his fingers, while tears rolled down her cheeks unbidden. She'd known him for less than a week, yet the loss felt as profound as if she'd lost a grandfather she'd known all her life. Abram Stevens was the first to move, gently placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "He's at peace now," he said softly, though his own voice cracked with emotion. "After 54 years, he's finally at peace." The veterans in the room began to salute one by one, their hands raised to their foreheads in final respect to a brother who'd carried their burdens in secret for decades. Jerome Washington, balanced on his prosthetic legs, held his salute, the longest tears streaming down his weathered face. "We should have known," Jerome whispered. "All those years he was out there watching over us like some guardian angel in a torn army jacket. We should have seen him." "He didn't want to be seen," Emily said, finally releasing Walter's hand. "That was the whole point. He wanted to help without anyone knowing, without anyone feeling indebted." Dr. Morrison quietly noted the time of death, but even he seemed reluctant to disturb the reverent atmosphere. It wasn't until the sun began to rise, painting the hospital room in soft golden light, that people began to slowly file out, each taking with them a piece of Walter's story to share with the world. Emily remembered the key Walter had mentioned and carefully retrieved his jacket from the closet. It was the same worn army jacket he'd worn to the gala, still carrying the faint scent of rain and street life. In the inner pocket, her fingers found a small brass key with a tag reading GCT 1847. She also discovered something else, a small leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age. "What is it?" Abram asked, noticing her discovery. Emily opened the notebook carefully. The first page contained a list of names in Walter's precise handwriting. Private Miguel Rodriguez, Sergeant James Johnson, Lieutenant Thomas Morrison, Corporal David Chen, Private First Class Anthony Williams, the 13 who had died saving him. But as she turned the pages, she found more names, hundreds, then thousands, each with a date, a brief note about their situation and what had been done to help. "My God," Abram breathed, reading over her shoulder. "This is everyone he ever helped." Some entries were simple. Mrs. Patricia Coleman, widow, 3 children, facing eviction, rent paid through end of year, November 1987. Others were more complex. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, no relation to the lawyer, PTSD, unemployed family struggling, arranged job interview through foundation contact, therapy paid for privately, kids' college funds established, 1993-2007. He tracked them all, Emily said in wonder. Every single person for decades. "We need to get to Grand Central," Abram said. "Whatever else is in that locker, it needs to be preserved." They left the hospital as the city was waking up. The news of Walter's death had already broken. Someone in the hospital had leaked it, and by the time they reached Grand Central Terminal, a small crowd of reporters had gathered, somehow having learned about their destination. "Miss Carter, Mr. Stevens, can you tell us about Walter Hayes's final words?" Is it true he had millions hidden away? What was in the locker? Abram pushed through them without comment, but Emily stopped remembering Walter's words about seeing the person beneath the circumstances. Walter Hayes died as he lived, she said simply, thinking of others. His last thoughts were of the veterans who need him help and the ones who died before they could get it. If you want to honor him, don't focus on the mystery or the money. Focus on the message. Look at the homeless veteran on your street corner and see a human being. That's all he ever wanted. Inside Grand Central, they found locker 1847 in a quiet corner of the lower level. The key turned easily, and inside they discovered 3 boxes, each carefully labeled. The first contained financial documents, not just records of the Hayes Foundation's official activities, but documentation of hundreds of anonymous donations made over the decades. The total was staggering, over $500 million, distributed so quietly and carefully that no one had ever connected the dots. The second box held sheet music compositions Walter had written over the years, but never shared. Each piece was titled with a date and a name from the list of the 13. Morrison's Lullaby, Rodriguez's Dance, Johnson's Prayer. At the bottom was a larger composition, clearly unfinished, titled simply Firebase Alpha A Requiem in 13 parts. But it was the third box that made Emily gasp. It contained photographs, hundreds of them. Walter with his unit in Vietnam, young and handsome in his army uniform, sitting at a battered upright piano. The 13 men who had died for him, captured in moments of life, laughing, playing cards, reading letters from home. And then more recent photos taken secretly over the years, veterans he'd helped, unaware they were being photographed, but captured in moments of joy. A man hugging his daughter at her graduation. A woman cutting the ribbon on a new business. Children playing in yards their parents had almost lost. He documented everything, Emily said, her voice full of wonder and sadness. Every life he touched. At the bottom of the box was an envelope addressed to whoever finds this. Inside, Walter's handwriting, shakier than in the older entries. If you're reading this, then I'm finally done running. For 54 years, I've been trying to repay a debt that can't be repaid, trying to save 13 lives that are already lost. I know now that was never possible, but in trying, I've discovered something: we're all connected by invisible threads of need and compassion. Every person we pass on the street is fighting a battle we know nothing about. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, ripples outward in ways we can't imagine. I chose to live on the streets, not as punishment, but as positioning. You can't see need from a penthouse. You can't hear desperation from behind thick walls. But from a park bench, from a shelter, from the forgotten corners of the city, you can see everything. Richard Thompson was not unique in his cruelty, just as I am not unique in my desire to help. There are thousands of Richard Thompsons out there using charity as a shield for greed. But there are also thousands of potential helpers, people who just need to be shown that they can make a difference. Use what I've left behind to build something better. Not a monument to me, God knows I don't deserve that. But a living, breathing network of support that sees veterans not as statistics or photo opportunities, but as human beings who sacrificed for others and deserve sacrifice in return. To Emily Carter, if you're the one reading this, you saw me when I was invisible. That's a gift. Don't lose it. To Abram Stevens, you remembered a moment of beauty in the midst of horror. That's strength. Use it. To everyone else, look closer. The person you ignore today might be the one who saves you tomorrow. Or perhaps you might be the one who saves them. Walter Martin Hayes, pianist, Firebase Alpha, 1947-2025. P.S. Tell them I heard music at the end. Tell them it was beautiful. Emily was crying openly now, clutching the letter, while Abram stood silent beside her, his own eyes wet with unshed tears. "We have work to do," Abram said finally. Over the next 3 weeks, the city transformed its grief into action. The story of Walter Hayes had captured something in the public imagination. Perhaps it was the image of him at that piano, shabby and dismissed, revealing himself as a master. Or perhaps it was the gradual revelation of just how many lives he'd touched in secret. Whatever it was, donations poured into the Veterans Support Center Fund. Not just from the wealthy, but from ordinary people sending $20, $50, whatever they could spare. Margaret Thompson became one of the center's most dedicated volunteers, working 18-hour days to help organize services. "I spent 30 years being useless," she told Emily one afternoon, sorting through applications for assistance. "I'm not wasting another day." The gala attendees who had laughed at Walter that night found themselves subject to intense public scrutiny. Several made substantial donations, whether from genuine remorse or public relations necessity. Others quietly increased their support for veterans' causes, finally understanding that charity wasn't about galas and tax breaks, but about seeing and serving real need. Jerome Washington started a program called Walter's Watch, organizing veterans to check on their homeless brothers and sisters, making sure no one fell through the cracks. "We're going to be the eyes Walter had," he explained to the growing group of volunteers. "We're going to see what others miss." Emily threw herself into her studies with renewed purpose, but she also spent every spare moment working on what she'd come to think of as Walter's project. She was transcribing his notebooks, creating a database of every person he'd helped, trying to track them down to see how they were doing. Many had thrived. The children whose educations he'd funded were now doctors, teachers, engineers. Others had struggled, despite his help reminding her that even $500 million couldn't solve every problem. 1 month after Walter's death, the Veterans Support Center held its official groundbreaking. The site was in Queens, accessible by multiple subway lines, in a neighborhood where real veterans actually lived, rather than some showcase location in Manhattan. Abram had fought off 3 attempts by developers to move it somewhere more prestigious. Walter wanted it where it was needed, not where it would look good in photos, he'd insisted. The ceremony was simple. No champagne, no gowns, no $5,000 plates. Just coffee donuts and folding chairs for anyone who wanted to attend. 3,000 people showed up. Emily was asked to speak. Standing at the podium looking out at the sea of faces, veterans, civilians, rich, poor, every color and creed, she thought about what Walter would want her to say. "Walter Hayes lived on the streets for 15 years, she began. "He had hundreds of millions of dollars, but he chose a park bench over a penthouse. People thought he was crazy. Maybe he was. But his craziness came from seeing too clearly, not from seeing wrong. He saw how we walk past each other every day, making assumptions based on appearance, missing the miracles hiding in plain sight." She paused, finding Jerome in the crowd, and Margaret, and dozens of others whose lives had been changed by a man they'd never known was helping them. "This center isn't a memorial to Walter Hayes. He wouldn't want that. It's a challenge. Every time you walk through these doors when they're built, you're accepting that challenge. To see more clearly, to help more freely, to judge less quickly, to remember that the person who looks like they have nothing might be the one who gives you everything." The piano from the Grand Legacy Ballroom had been purchased and sat on the temporary platform, covered and waiting. Abram had arranged for it to be the ceremonial first piece installed in the new building. "Walter's last request," Emily continued, "was that this piano be placed in the center, and that anyone who wants to play it be allowed to. Music," he said, "heals things medicine can't touch. So before we break ground, before we build walls and install services, we're going to fill this space with music." She pulled the cover off the piano, revealing its polished ebony surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. Would anyone like to play? For a moment, no one moved. Then from the back of the crowd came a shuffling figure. Another homeless veteran, from the looks of him, worn clothes, unkempt beard, that particular way of walking that spoke of old injuries and persistent pain. The crowd parted to let him through. He sat at the piano bench, his weathered hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the keys. Then without preamble, he began to play. It wasn't Chopin or Debussy. It was Amazing Grace, simple and pure, but played with such feeling that it transformed the hymn into something new. "I knew Walter," the man said, as he played, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Not his name, not his story, but I knew him. He'd show up at the shelter sometimes, never took a bed if someone else needed it more. He'd sit with us, listen to our stories, never judging, never preaching. Sometimes he'd hum while he sat there, and now I realize he was composing. All those beautiful pieces he wrote, we were there when he created them. We just didn't know." Others came forward. Veterans mostly, but also civilians who'd encountered Walter over the years. Each played something, sometimes skillfully, sometimes just picking out a melody with one finger. But each performance carried weight, carried meaning. The piano that had stood in that ballroom witness to mockery and revelation was being baptized with the music of the people Walter had spent his life serving. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the construction site, Emily noticed something. A news crew had been filming, but they'd put down their cameras. The reporters were crying. The construction workers who'd come to prep the site stood in respectful silence. Even the traffic on the nearby street seemed to have slowed, as if the city itself was listening. The last person to play was a child maybe 8 years old, led forward by her mother. "This is Sofia Rodriguez," the mother said. Her grandfather was Private Miguel Rodriguez. He died saving Walter Hayes in Vietnam. The little girl sat at the piano and played "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" with the careful concentration of a student. When she finished, she looked up at the crowd. "My mom says my grandpa was a hero, and Mr. Walter was a hero too. She says heroes aren't just people who fight in wars. Heroes are people who see other people hurting and try to help. So I want to be a hero too." And the crowd erupted in applause, not the polite golf clap of the gala, but real, heartfelt appreciation. Emily felt someone take her hand and looked to see Margaret Thompson beside her, tears streaming down both their faces. "He did it," Margaret said. "That strange, wonderful man actually did it. He changed us." As the crowd began to disperse, Emily stayed behind with Abram, sitting on the edge of the platform where the piano stood. The construction site didn't look like much yet, just cleared ground and marking stakes, but she could see what it would become. Treatment rooms where veterans could get help without shame. Music therapy rooms where Walter's compositions would help heal invisible wounds. Meeting spaces where stories could be shared and burdens lightened. "I've been thinking about the name," Abram said. "The Walter Hayes Veterans Support Center is too long, too formal. He wouldn't like it." "What do you suggest?" "Firebase Alpha." Emily smiled. He'd hate that too. Too much attention on him. "Then what?" Emily thought about Walter's letter, about his description of invisible threads connecting everyone, about his music that had reached across decades to change lives, about 13 men who died believing a pianist was worth saving. "The 13, she said finally. "Just that. Simple, mysterious enough that people will ask about it, and when they do, we can tell them the story. Not just Walter's story, but all of their stories. The ones who died, the ones who survived, the ones still fighting." Abram nodded slowly. "The 13. I like it." As they sat in the gathering darkness, the The piano behind them seemed to hold the echoes of everyone who'd played it that day. Emily could almost hear Walter's voice, amused and gentle. "You're making too much fuss. Just help people. That's all that matters." 3 months later, the 13 opened its doors for the first time. The building was simple but dignified, with clean lines and lots of light. The piano sat in the main entrance with a small plaque that read, "Play Me." On opening day, a line of veterans stretched around the block. Not for photo opportunities or free food, but for real help, medical care, psychiatric services, job training, housing assistance. Everything was free, no questions asked, no judgment passed. Emily was there, having arranged her clinical rotation to include the 13. She watched as veteran after veteran entered, many hesitant, some skeptical, but all treated with the dignity Walter had insisted upon. Around noon, she noticed a disturbance near the entrance. Richard Thompson had arrived. He looked different, thinner, older, his previously perfect hair now gray at the temples. He was wearing a simple suit, nothing like the $5,000 tuxedos he used to favor. The veterans recognized him, and the atmosphere grew tense. "I have no right to be here," Thompson said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent lobby. "I know that, but I needed to come. I needed to say something." Security moved forward, but Abram held up a hand, stopping them. Thompson continued, "I've had 3 months to think about that night. About how I laughed at a man who had more courage in his little finger than I've had in my entire life. About how I built my fortune on the backs of veterans while claiming to support them. I've been convicted. I'm going to prison. But before I do, I wanted to do one thing right." He pulled out a document. "I'm liquidating everything. My entire estate, all my hidden assets, everything the FBI didn't freeze. $43 million. It's all going to the 13. It doesn't make up for what I did, but maybe it can help undo some of the damage." The silence stretched. Then Jerome Washington wheeled forward in his chair. "You mocked a good man," Jerome said. "You hurt a lot of people, but Walter believed in redemption. He believed people could change. So here's the deal: you donate that money, and we'll use it to help people you hurt. But you also volunteer here, every week until you go to prison. You'll see the faces of the people your greed affected. You'll hear their stories. You'll understand what you did." Thompson's face crumbled. Yes, I'll do that." "Then welcome to the 13 quota," Jerome said, though his tone suggested the welcome was conditional and would need to be earned. As Thompson was led away to fill out paperwork, Emily found herself at the piano. Without really thinking about it, she sat down and began to play one of Walter's compositions she'd been studying, Morrison's Lullaby. It was gentle but complex, like a mother singing to a child, but with harmonies that spoke of adult understanding of loss. Others gathered around, some recognizing the style if not the specific piece. When she finished, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, came the sound of slow clapping. Others joined in, and Emily realized they weren't applauding her, they were applauding Walter, whose music lived on even though he was gone. That night, Emily went home to her small apartment, exhausted, but fulfilled in a way she'd never experienced before. On her desk sat Walter's notebook, which Abram had insisted she keep. "You're the chronicler of this story," he'd said. "Someday, when people ask how the 13 came to be, you'll be the one to tell them." She opened the notebook to a random page and found an entry she hadn't seen before. "Today I watched a young woman, a server at some fancy event, help an old veteran who'd fallen on the sidewalk. Everyone else walked past, but she stopped. She helped him up, made sure he was okay, even gave him the sandwich from her lunch bag. She'll never know I saw her. She'll never know that her kindness convinced me that there's still hope for this city, this world. Small acts of grace unwitnessed except by accident. That's what holds us together. The date was 3 years ago, long before Emily had met Walter at the gala. She tried to remember, and then it came back an old man who'd tripped outside the hotel where she'd been working a catering job. She'd helped him up, given him her lunch because he'd looked hungry. She'd never thought about it again. But Walter had seen. Walter had remembered. She looked out her window at the city lights and thought about all the invisible threads connecting everyone, acts of kindness and cruelty choices that rippled outward in ways no one could predict. Somewhere out there in apartments and shelters and on street corners were thousands of people Walter had helped. And somewhere out there were thousands more who still needed help. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But it had been properly begun. As she prepared for bed, Emily thought she heard something faint, possibly imagined but unmistakable to her ears. Piano music drifting on the night wind. Not from any earthly source, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere beyond. It sounded like Walter playing one final song for the 13 who had saved him, and for all the ones he'd tried to save in return. It sounded like completion. The music Emily thought she heard that night wasn't imagined. 3 blocks away, in a small apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant, an elderly woman named Linh Nguyen sat at her own piano playing a melody she'd learned from a homeless man who'd sometimes sheltered in her restaurant's doorway during the worst winter storms. She'd never known his name was Walter Hayes, only that he'd hummed beautiful music while she'd brought him hot soup and let him warm himself by her kitchen's back door. The ripples of Walter's life continued to spread outward in ways no one could have predicted. 6 months after the 13 opened, Emily was reviewing patient files when she discovered something that made her hands tremble. Among the veterans seeking treatment was a name she recognized from Walter's notebook: Corporal Marcus Chen, brother of David Chen, one of the 13 who died at Firebase Alpha. Marcus was 68 now, dealing with late-stage liver disease from decades of alcohol abuse, trying to forget his brother's death. He'd been living in his car for 3 months, too proud to seek help, until his body simply gave out. "Mr. Chen," Emily said gently when she entered his room. "I'm Emily Carter. I'm one of the nurses here." Marcus looked up with eyes that held the same 1,000-yard stare she'd seen in so many veterans, but there was something else there too, a flicker of recognition, when he saw the piano visible through his doorway. "That piano," he said, his voice hoarse. "It reminds me of something. My brother David, he used to talk about this guy in his unit who played piano. Said the music kept them human when everything else was trying to turn them into animals." Emily sat down beside his bed, her heart racing. "Your brother served at Firebase Alpha." Marcus's eyes sharpened. "You know about Firebase Alpha. I know about the 13 men who died there. David was one of them. He died saving a pianist named Walter Hayes." The change in Marcus was immediate. He struggled to sit up, his frail body shaking with emotion. "Walter survived all these years. I thought they all died. The report was so confused, and then they classified everything." "Where is he? Where's Walter?" Emily took his hand gently. "Mr. Chen, Walter did survive. He came home and spent the rest of his life trying to honor your brother and the others who saved him. He founded this place in a way. He died 6 months ago, but not before making sure veterans like you would always have somewhere to turn." Marcus began to cry, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long buried. David would have been so happy. He loved that music. In his last letter, he said listening to Walter play made him remember why they were fighting, not for politics or territory, but to preserve beautiful things, gentle things. Emily reached for Walter's notebook, which she'd taken to carrying with her. She found David Chen's entry and read it to Marcus. David Chen, 22, from San Francisco, loved mathematics and music equally, was going to be an engineer, died throwing himself on a grenade that would have killed 3 others, including me. His last words were, "Tell my brother I'm not afraid." I've been looking for Marcus for 30 years. Can't find him. If you ever read this, Marcus, your brother died brave and at peace. He saved my life so I could save others. Every person I've helped has been partly thanks to David. Marcus held the notebook like it was sacred text, his tears falling on the yellowed pages. He looked for me. For 30 years, Emily confirmed. He never stopped looking. That afternoon, Marcus insisted on being wheeled to the piano. His hands were shaky from his illness, but he placed them on the keys with reverence. David taught me this, he said, and began to pick out a simple melody, a Chinese lullaby their mother had sung to them as children. He said, "If anything ever happened to him, I should play it, and remember that beauty survives even when people don't." Others gathered as they always did when someone played Walter's piano. Margaret Thompson was there now, running the 13's family support services. Jerome Washington had stopped by between his rounds checking on homeless veterans. Even Richard Thompson was present, fulfilling his volunteer hours before his upcoming sentencing. As Marcus played, Emily noticed Richard crying, not the calculated tears of a man trying to gain sympathy, but real, broken sobs. The man who'd mocked Walter for offering to play for food was now weeping at a simple lullaby played by a dying veteran. "I'm so sorry," Richard said to no one in particular. "God, I'm so sorry." It was Margaret who surprised everyone by walking over to her soon-to-be ex-husband and placing a hand on his shoulder. "We all are," she said simply. "The question is, what we do with that sorrow." That evening, Abram called an emergency board meeting. The 13 was succeeding beyond their wildest dreams, but success brought problems. They were running out of space, turning away veterans who needed help. They needed to expand, but the adjacent properties were owned by a development company planning to build luxury condos. "We need $15 million to buy them out," Abram said, running his hands through his gray hair. "We have $8 million in reserve, but that won't be enough." "What about a fundraiser?" someone suggested. "Another gala?" "No," Emily said firmly. "Walter would hate that. No galas, no $5,000 plates. That's not who we are." "Then what?" Abram asked. Before anyone could answer, Richard Thompson stood up. "I'll get the money." Everyone turned to stare at him. "I can't access my frozen assets," he continued, "but I still have connections. People who owe me favors. Give me 3 days." "Why would you do this?" Jerome asked suspiciously. Richard was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because I've spent 3 hours a week for 6 months listening to stories of people my greed destroyed. Because I watch that piano every day and remember how I laughed at a man who was worth 1,000 of me. Because my sentencing is next week and I need to do something, just one thing, that isn't about profit or power or protecting myself." "And if you can't get the money," Abram asked, "then I'll have failed, but I need to try." Walter spent 50 years trying to repay a debt that couldn't be repaid. Let me spend my last week of freedom trying to repay mine. They gave him 3 days. Richard Thompson's last week of freedom became a strange sort of pilgrimage through New York's financial district. He visited every banker, every developer, every hedge fund manager he'd ever worked with. But instead of the smooth talking and veiled threats that had been his trademark, he told them Walter's story. There was this homeless veteran. He'd begin sitting in offices that looked out over the city. He walked into my gala and I laughed at him. Some threw him out. Others listened but declined to help. but a few those who'd perhaps been carrying their own guilt about the lives they'd built on others' losses wrote checks. On the morning of the third day, 2 hours before the deadline to make an offer on the properties, Richard walked into the 13 carrying a banker's check for $7 million. "It's not enough," he said, exhausted and defeated. "I'm sorry. I tried." But then the doors opened again, and Lin Nguyen entered, the Vietnamese restaurant owner who'd fed Walter all those winters. Behind her came a stream of people, shop owners from the neighborhood families Walter had helped, even some homeless veterans carrying crumpled bills. "We heard the 13 needed help," Lin said simply. She placed a check on the table. "My life savings, $40,000. That man, Mr. Walter, he saved my son's life once. Paid for his cancer treatment when we had no insurance. I never knew it was him until after he died." Others came forward. $10 here, $100 there, someone's entire $1,000 tax refund. By noon, they had another $300,000, still not enough, but the gesture meant everything. Then Marcus Chen, who'd been given less than a month to live, made an announcement from his wheelchair. "I'm dying," he said bluntly. "No point pretending otherwise. I have a life insurance policy worth $2 million and no family to leave it to. I'm naming the 13 as my beneficiary. But more than that, I have something else." He pulled out a worn envelope. "My brother David was a mathematics prodigy. Before he deployed, he invested his college fund in this tiny company called Intel. Told me to hold on to the stock no matter what. I've been homeless 3 times, been so hungry. I've eaten from dumpsters, but I never sold it, because it was all I had left of David." He handed the envelope to Abram. 4,000 shares of Intel stock purchased in 1968. I had a lawyer friend check it's worth about $8 million now with all the splits and dividends. It's yours. David died to save Walter, and Walter built this place. It's like David's still saving people 56 years later." The room erupted. People were crying, hugging, celebrating. They had more than enough now. They could buy the properties and still have money for operations. Richard Thompson stood in the corner watching it all, with an expression of wonder. "This is what I never understood," he said to Emily. "I thought money was about power, about taking. But Walter knew it was about giving. Every dollar he gave away came back multiplied, not in money, but in this." He gestured at the room full of people united in purpose. "Your sentencing is tomorrow," Emily said gently. "I know. 10 years probably, maybe 7 with good behavior." He managed a small smile. "I'll be 70 when I get out. If the 13 will have me, I'd like to volunteer again when I'm free." "Everyone deserves a second chance," Emily said, thinking of Walter and all the second chances he'd given. "That's what this place is about." The next day, Richard Thompson was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. But before he was taken away, he made one last statement to the press. "I spent my life building towers that scraped the sky, but they were built on foundations of greed and exploitation. Walter Hayes lived on the streets and built something eternal, a network of compassion that will outlive any building I ever constructed. I'm going to prison for my crimes, and I deserve to. But I'm grateful for the chance to have met Walter Hayes, even if I was too blind to see who he really was at first. He showed me that it's never too late to change, never too late to choose differently. The 13 will continue his work long after we're all gone because compassion, unlike concrete, doesn't crumble with time." As Richard was led away in handcuffs, Emily noticed something remarkable. The veterans at the 13, many of whom had every reason to hate him, saluted. Not Richard Thompson, the criminal, but the man who'd finally understood what Walter had been trying to teach all along. A year passed. The 13 expanded into the new buildings, tripling its capacity. The piano in the lobby was played daily, sometimes professionally, sometimes hesitantly, but always with heart. Marcus Chen had died peacefully 2 months after donating his brother's stock, his last words reportedly being, "I can hear David's music." Emily graduated from nursing school at the top of her class and immediately began working full-time at the 13. She also started work on a book about Walter using his notebooks and the stories she'd collected from hundreds of people he'd helped. One autumn evening, as she was working late in her office, she heard piano music drifting up from the lobby. This wasn't unusual, but something about this playing made her stop and listen. It was one of Walter's compositions, Rodriguez's Dance, but played with a skill and understanding that took her breath away. She went downstairs to find a young woman at the piano, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair and familiar features. When the woman turned, Emily gasped. She had Walter's pale blue eyes. "You're Emily Carter," the woman said. "I'm Sarah Hayes. Walter was my grandfather." Emily's mind raced. Walter had never mentioned family, and all their research had suggested he'd had none. Sarah seemed to read her confusion. "He had a daughter, my mother, before Vietnam. When he came back so broken, he thought she'd be better off without him. He provided for us financially, but never made contact. My mother didn't even know he was alive until she saw the news coverage of his death." "Why didn't you come forward earlier?" Emily asked. "We weren't sure we should. He clearly chose to keep us secret for a reason, but my mother is dying cancer, and she wanted me to come here to see what her father built, to understand who he really was." Sarah's fingers found the keys again, playing a melody Emily didn't recognize. "He wrote this for my mother," Sarah explained. She found it in an envelope that arrived the day after he died. 50 years of birthday and Christmas presents. He'd never sent all arriving at once. And this composition titled, "For the Daughter I Loved Too Much to Burden with My Ghosts." The music was different from Walter's other pieces, lighter somehow, full of hope, rather than tinged with sorrow. It sounded like a father's love, pure and uncomplicated, unmarred by war or loss. "Will you tell me about him?" Sarah asked. "Not the legend everyone's talking about, but the man you knew." Emily sat beside her on the piano bench, thinking about the week she'd known Walter Hayes. Such a short time, but it had changed everything. "He was tired," she began. "So tired he could barely stand, but he stood anyway, because someone needed him to. He was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed, but he used his broken pieces to build shelters for others. He was the loneliest man I've ever met, but he made sure that no one else had to be alone." She pulled out Walter's notebook, showing Sarah her grandfather's handwriting, his careful documentation of lives saved and debts he felt he could never fully repay. He loved music more than life itself, but he loved people more than music. He could have had concert halls and recording contracts, but he chose park benches and soup kitchens because that's where the need was greatest. He didn't just help veterans, he became one with them, sharing their struggles, their invisibility, their pain. Sarah was crying now, silent tears rolling down her cheeks as she played. The melody shifted, becoming something that sounded like a conversation between two pianos, questions and answers, call and response. "My mother wants to donate," Sarah said finally. "She inherited everything Walter left, more money than we even knew existed. She wants to give it all to the 13, every penny. That's hundreds of millions of dollars," Emily said, stunned. $732 million actually, Sarah said. "He was apparently very good at investing. But my mother says money was his language for love, the only way he knew how to take care of people without getting too close. She wants his love to keep spreading." The donation would transform the 13 from a single center to a nationwide network. Centers in every major city, help for every veteran who needed it. Walter's dream amplified beyond anything he'd probably imagined. "There's one condition," Sarah added. "My mother wants to meet you. She's too sick to travel, but she wants to hear about her father from someone who knew him at the end. Will you come?" Emily agreed immediately. 2 days later, she flew to Seattle, where Mary Hayes Walter's daughter lived, in a modest house despite her newfound wealth. Mary looked like Walter, the same pale eyes, the same dignified bearing, despite her illness. She was sitting at her own piano when Emily arrived, though she was too weak to play. "Tell me everything," Mary said simply. "From the moment he walked into that ballroom until his last breath. Don't spare anything." Emily talked for 3 hours, sharing every detail she could remember. The mockery at the gala, the transformation when he played the revelation of who he really was. His time in the hospital, his final words about seeing the 13 waiting for him. "He talked about them constantly in his letters," Mary said when Emily finished. "The 13 who died for him. He felt he should have died instead, that a pianist wasn't worth 13 soldiers. He never understood that his music, his compassion, his life's work, that was worth everything they sacrificed, and more." She pulled out a box of letters all unopened. "He wrote to me every week for 50 years. Never mailed them, but he wrote them. I found them in a storage unit after he died. I haven't been able to read them all, too painful, but maybe someday you could include them in that book you're writing." "You know about the book?" "Sarah told me. I think it's wonderful. The world should know who Walter Hayes really was. Not the mystery millionaire or the homeless genius, but the father who loved too deeply to risk hurting anyone with his proximity." Mary died 2 weeks later, peaceful in the knowledge that her father's work would continue. Sarah played at her funeral Walter's composition for his daughter, and there wasn't a dry eye in the chapel. The news of the massive donation made headlines worldwide. "Homeless vet's daughter donates $732 million to veterans charity." But at the 13, they barely noticed the media frenzy. They were too busy with the daily work of healing, helping, and honoring Walter's legacy, one person at a time. Richard Thompson, writing from federal prison, sent a letter to be read at the next board meeting. "I've been teaching music here. Can you believe that the man who mocked Walter Hayes for playing piano is now teaching other inmates to play? We have an old upright that's missing half its keys, but when I play it, I remember that night. I remember thinking Walter was beneath me because of his clothes, his status. Now I wear prison gray and understand that clothes don't make the man. Actions do, choices do. I have 6 more years to serve, but I'm not counting days until my release. I'm counting the small goods I can do each day, the Walter Hayes way, invisible, uncelebrated, but real. Keep a piano warm for me. When I get out, I want to play Claire de Lune in the lobby of the 13, not for money or applause, but because beautiful things should exist wherever there's pain." Emily stood in the lobby that evening, watching as the last veteran of the day left with a job placement housing voucher, and most importantly, hope. The piano sat silent for once, its ebony surface reflecting the setting sun through the windows. She sat down and played the first thing Walter had played that night at the gala, Shenandoah, but in his complex arrangement that turned a simple folk song into something transcendent. As she played, people stopped to listen, staff, volunteers, a few veterans who'd stayed late. When she finished, Jerome Washington spoke from his wheelchair. "You know, I used to think Walter's playing that night was about showing those rich folks up, proving he was better than them. But I was wrong. It wasn't about being better. It was about being human, fully human, in a room full of people who'd forgotten what that meant. He reminded us," Margaret Thompson added, now bearing her maiden name of Margaret Chen after her divorce was finalized. "He reminded us that we're all just people, all struggling, all needing help sometimes. All capable of helping. Abram corrected gently. That was his real message. Not that we should pity the less fortunate, but that fortune is temporary, and what matters is how we treat each other when our positions could so easily be reversed. As Emily walked home that night, she passed a homeless man sitting against a building, a cardboard sign beside him reading "Veteran. Anything helps." She stopped, gave him $20, but more importantly, she sat down beside him. "What's your name?" she asked. "Tommy," he said, surprised anyone was asking. "Tommy Rodriguez." Emily's heart skipped. Rodriguez, any relation to Miguel Rodriguez? He served in Vietnam Fire Base Alpha. Tommy's eyes widened. "He was my uncle. Died before I was born." "How did you—" "Come with me," Emily said, helping him up. "There's someone's story you need to hear, and a place where your uncle's sacrifice is honored every single day." As they walked toward the 13, Emily could almost hear Walter's music on the wind, that eternal melody of loss and redemption, payment and debt, the endless cycle of human beings trying to save each other from the darkness. She thought about the ripples still spreading from that night at the gala. Richard learning compassion in prison. Margaret finding purpose in service. Abram building something worthy of the lives lost, and hundreds of veterans finding help because one man chose to reveal himself at exactly the right moment. But mostly she thought about Walter himself, the ghost of Firebase Alpha, who'd haunted New York's streets not as punishment, but as mission turning survivors' guilt into $500 million of quiet salvation. Tommy Rodriguez stood frozen in the 13's lobby, staring at the wall of photographs Emily had just shown him, images from Firebase Alpha, including one of his uncle Miguel Young, and smiling arm draped around Walter Hayes's shoulders beside a battered piano. His fingers traced his uncle's face through the glass, and when he spoke, his voice cracked with emotion. "My grandmother kept one photo of him," Tommy said. "Just one in her bedroom. She'd kiss it every night before bed until the day she died. She always said Miguel died a hero, but nobody ever told us the whole story." Emily guided him to a chair, noticing how his hands shook, not from withdrawal or illness, but from the overwhelming discovery of a connection he'd never known existed. She pulled out Walter's notebook, finding Miguel's entry, and began to read aloud. "Miguel Rodriguez, 19, from El Paso. Wanted to be a teacher. Sent half his combat pay home to support his mother and younger siblings. Died pushing Walter out of the way of machine gun fire. His last words were asking me to tell his family he wasn't scared." Tommy broke down completely, then sobbing with the kind of raw grief that comes from old wounds suddenly torn open. Emily sat with him in silence, understanding that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is simply witnessing their pain. When he finally composed himself, Tommy looked around the 13 with new eyes. "All of this exists because my uncle saved him. All of this exists because your uncle and 12 others believed a pianist's life was worth saving," Emily corrected gently, "and because Walter spent 54 years proving them right." That night, Tommy Rodriguez became the 13's newest resident, not just receiving help, but becoming part of the continuing story. Within a week, he was helping in the kitchen, his military training making him efficient and organized. Within a month, he was assisting Jerome Washington with outreach to homeless veterans, his own recent experience on the streets making him uniquely qualified to build trust. 3 years passed. The 13 had expanded to 12 cities with plans for more. Each center had a piano in its lobby, and each piano had the same simple plaque, "Play Me." The Walter Hayes Foundation, now managed by Sarah Hayes with Emily as an advisor, had distributed over $1 billion to veterans' causes, but always quietly, always without fanfare. Emily's book, The Ghost of Firebase Alpha, had been published to critical acclaim with all proceeds going to the 13. But more importantly, it had sparked a national conversation about how society treats its veterans and its vulnerable populations. Book clubs discussed it, schools taught it, and more than one city official had been shamed into action by constituents asking, "What would Walter Hayes see if he walked our streets?" On a cold November evening, exactly 4 years after Walter's death, Emily stood in the original 13's lobby for a special gathering. Hundreds had come, veterans who'd been helped, volunteers who'd been inspired, donors who'd been moved to action. But the guest of honor was someone nobody expected. Richard Thompson entered the building for the first time since his release from federal prison 6 months early for good behavior. He was 70 now, thin and gray, but there was something different about him, a humility that had replaced his former arrogance, a quietness that suggested hard-won wisdom. "I didn't think you'd come," Emily said, greeting him at the door. "I almost didn't," Richard admitted. "I wasn't sure I had the right, but I made a promise, and I've learned the importance of keeping those." He walked to the piano, Walter's piano, and sat down slowly, as if approaching something sacred. The room fell silent as his fingers found the keys. He began to play Clair de Lune, not with Walter's transcendent skill, but with something perhaps more valuable, genuine understanding of what the music meant. As he played, Emily noticed tears on his weathered face. When he finished, he didn't stand immediately, but sat with his hands resting on the keys. "I taught over 200 inmates to play piano," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Murderers, thieves, people society had written off. And every single one of them, when they finally got a melody right, smiled like children. That's when I understood what Walter knew, that music doesn't care who you are or what you've done. It only cares that you're human enough to create something beautiful." Margaret stepped forward, his ex-wife, now one of the 13's most dedicated board members. "You did well, Richard. Walter would be proud." "I doubt that," Richard said with a rueful smile. "But maybe he'd be satisfied that the lesson finally sank in." As the evening progressed, story after story emerged. A young veteran named Janet spoke about how the 13's job training program had helped her become a software engineer. An elderly man named Carl credited the music therapy program with helping him finally process trauma from Korea. A teenager named Marcus, named after Marcus Chen, talked about how the 13's family support program had kept his household together when his father deployed. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah Hayes took the stage. She'd become an accomplished pianist in her own right, and she sat at Walter's piano to play something nobody had heard before. "This is the last piece my grandfather ever wrote," she explained. "He composed it in his mind during his final days in the hospital, but never had the chance to write it down. He hummed it to Emily, and she hummed it to me. And I've spent 3 years trying to capture what I heard." The piece was unlike anything Walter had written before. It began with 13 distinct melodic lines, each representing one of the fallen interweaving and supporting each other. Then gradually, other melodies joined, hundreds of them, each representing a life touched, a veteran helped, a connection made. The music built and built until it seemed impossible that one person with 2 hands could be creating such complexity. And then, at the climax, all the melodies resolved into a simple single note, the same B-flat that Walter had played to begin his performance at the gala. But now it didn't sound like a question. It sounded like an answer. When Sarah finished, the silence lasted a full minute before anyone could bring themselves to break it with applause. When they finally did, it wasn't the polite clapping of a concert hall, but something more primal, a recognition that they'd witnessed not just a performance, but a completion of something that had begun in a fire base in Vietnam 57 years ago. Tommy Rodriguez stood up. "I want to say something," He announced, his voice stronger than it had been 3 years ago when Emily first brought him here. My Uncle Miguel died believing he was saving something worth saving. For years, I thought that meant he died for nothing. What's a pianist in a war zone? But now I understand. He didn't just save a pianist. He saved all of us. Every person Walter helped. Every person. Those people helped. Every ripple spreading outward. We're all here because Miguel Rodriguez and 12 others made a choice about what was worth dying for. He paused, looking around the room at the assembled faces, black, white, brown, young, old, rich, poor, all united by their connection to Walter's story. And Walter made a choice about what was worth living for, Tommy continued. Not comfort, not fame, not even happiness. He chose to live for us, the broken and forgotten ones. He chose to be invisible so he could see clearly. He chose to have nothing so he could give everything. Jerome Washington wheeled forward. I've been thinking about that night at the gala a lot lately. We all focus on Walter's revelation, his performance, the way he changed everything. But you know what strikes me most? He asked to play for food. Not for money, not for respect, for food. The most basic human need. And they laughed at him for it. He turned to address the room. How many times do we walk past someone asking for basic needs and judge them for it? How many Walter Hayeses are out there right now? Invisible, carrying stories we'll never know because we don't stop to look. This sparked a discussion that lasted hours, with people sharing their own stories of judgment and redemption of times. They'd been the one laughing, and times they'd been the one laughed at. The conversation continued, even as people began to leave, spreading out into the night, carrying the questions with them. Emily found herself alone in the lobby as midnight approached, just as she'd been 4 years ago after Walter's death. But this time she wasn't alone. Abram Stevens, now 84, but still sharp, sat beside her on a bench they'd installed facing the piano. I'm retiring next month, Abram said quietly. My health isn't what it was, and it's time for younger hands to steer this ship. The board wants you to take over, Emily said, not surprised. I know. Will you? Emily considered the question. At 27, she'd be the youngest director the 13 had ever had. But she'd also been there from the beginning, had held Walter's hand. As he died, had carried his notebook, like a sacred text, for 4 years. On one condition, she said. We never forget that this isn't about running an organization. It's about seeing people, really seeing them. The moment we become more concerned with budgets than with souls, we've failed Walter's memory. Agreed, Abram said. Then more quietly, you know I've been wealthy my entire adult life. Built companies, employed thousands, donated millions to charity. But nothing I ever did mattered as much as that moment in 1969 when a young pianist played Clair de Lune for a homesick soldier. And nothing I've done since matters as much as trying to repay that gift. They sat in comfortable silence, and then Abram asked, Do you think he knew? When he walked into that ballroom, do you think Walter knew how it would all unfold? Emily thought about it. I think he knew it was time. Time to stop hiding, time to use his invisibility one last time to make people see. He was dying, that the doctors said his heart had been failing for months. He could have died quietly on the streets, another forgotten veteran. Instead, he chose to make his death mean something. His life, Abram corrected. He chose to make his life mean something. His death was just the punctuation mark. The next morning, Emily arrived at the 13 to find a surprise. A young man, maybe 25, was playing the piano with extraordinary skill. But it wasn't his talent that made her stop, it was what he was playing. It was Walter's unfinished Requiem, Firebase Alpha A Requiem in 13 parts. But completed, fully realized, the missing movements filled in with such authenticity that it could have been Walter himself. "Who are you?" Emily asked when he finished. The young man turned, and Emily saw he had burn scars covering half his face, the kind that came from an IED explosion. "Specialist James Morrison," he said. "No relation to Lieutenant Morrison from Firebase Alpha, just a coincidence of names. I was a combat medic in Afghanistan until this happened." He gestured to his scars. "Spent 18 months in the hospital, wanted to die every single day. Then someone left a copy of your book on my bedside table. Never found out who." He turned back to the piano. "I'd studied composition before enlisting. When I read about Walter's unfinished Requiem, I became obsessed with it. Spent 2 years studying everything he'd written, trying to understand his musical language, his voice. Last night I finally figured out how it should end." "How?" Emily asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "It doesn't end with resolution," James said. "It ends with a question the same B-flat Walter started with at the gala. Because the story isn't over. Every day in every city, there are Firebase Alphas happening, people sacrificing for others, people choosing what's worth saving. The Requiem can't end because the thing it's commemorating hasn't ended." He played the last movement again, and Emily heard it clearly, 13 melodies becoming hundreds, hundreds becoming thousands, a musical representation of how sacrifice ripples outward through time. And then that single note hanging in the air, waiting for the next person to answer it. "Will you teach it to others?" Emily asked. "Everyone who wants to learn," James promised. As Emily took over leadership of the 13, she instituted a new tradition. Every evening at closing time, someone would play a portion of the Firebase Alpha Requiem. Not as performance, but as prayer, as reminder, as renewal of purpose. And always they would end with that questioning B-flat, letting it hang in the air as people dispersed into the night. Richard Thompson became one of the most dedicated volunteers, teaching piano to veterans with PTSD, discovering that music could reach places that words couldn't touch. "I spent my life building walls," he told Emily one day. "Now I'm trying to build bridges, one note at a time." Sarah Hayes split her time between managing the foundation and performing concerts where she told Walter's story, donating all proceeds to veterans' causes. She'd found letters from Walter to her grandmother among his effects. Letters never sent, full of love and longing and explanation. She'd turned them into a song cycle that made audiences weep from Seattle to Miami. Tommy Rodriguez eventually became the 13's director of outreach, his own journey from the streets giving him credibility no degree could provide. He kept a photo of his Uncle Miguel on his desk, right next to one of Walter at the piano, the two men who'd saved each other in different ways across decades. On the 5th anniversary of Walter's death, the 13 held its first national conference. Representatives from all 23 centers gathered in New York, along with hundreds of veterans, volunteers, and supporters. The keynote speaker was someone nobody expected, a 90-year-old woman named Elizabeth Chen, David Chen's widow. "I thought I'd lost everything when David died," she said, her voice still strong despite her age. "My husband, my future, my faith in meaning. I spent 50 years angry at Walter Hayes for surviving when David didn't. Why should a pianist live when a mathematician died? What sense did that make?" She paused, looking out at the assembled crowd. "But now I see what David saw that night at Firebase Alpha. He saw that beauty matters. That in the midst of horror and death, someone who could create beauty, who could remind soldiers they were human, who could carry their stories forward in music, that person had to survive. David didn't die for Walter Hayes. He died for all of you, for everyone who would be touched by the music Walter would play and the lives he would save." She sat down at the piano, her aged fingers finding the keys with surprising grace. David taught me this before he left for Vietnam. Said if anything happened to him that I should play it, and remember that love transcends death. She played a simple melody, the same Chinese lullaby Marcus Chen had played before his death. But when she finished, instead of silence, another piano joined in, Richard Thompson playing a harmony from the second piano they'd installed. Then James Morrison on a keyboard adding another layer. Then Sarah Hayes, then others, until the room filled with dozens of people playing together, each adding their own voice to the collective song. Emily stood watching Walter's notebook in her hands, thinking about the transformation she'd witnessed. The same room that 5 years ago had hosted a gala where the wealthy mocked a homeless veteran, now held a gathering where former enemies played music together, where the broken helped heal the broken, where Walter's ghost presided over a congregation he'd never imagined. As the music swelled, Emily opened the notebook to the last entry. Walter had written something she'd never shared with anyone. Tonight, I will walk into a room full of people who think they're better than me. They're wrong, but not in the way they'll think when I reveal myself. They're wrong because no one is better than anyone. We're all just humans carrying our damage, trying to make sense of our pain. Some of us hide it behind wealth, others behind poverty. Some behind cruelty, others behind kindness. But underneath, we're all afraid, all lonely, all hoping someone will see us for who we really are and love us anyway. I've lived as a ghost for so long, I've forgotten what it's like to be seen. But tonight, for the 13 who saved me, for all the ones I couldn't save, for Emily, who looked at me with genuine concern, for everyone who needs to know that worth isn't measured in possessions or power tonight. I will let myself be visible one last time. If you're reading this, I'm gone. But the music remains. The connections remain. The love, especially, the love remains. Every time someone plays a piano in the 13, I'm there. Every time someone sees past appearance to essence, I'm there. Every time someone chooses compassion over comfort, sacrifice over safety, others over self, I'm there. We are all ghosts, haunting each other with our needs and our gifts. The question is, what kind of haunting will we choose to be, play on? The requiem is never finished. WMH. As Emily closed the notebook, the music reached its crescendo, hundreds of voices and instruments joining together in a sound that seemed to shake the building's foundations. And then, as if by unspoken agreement, everyone stopped at once, leaving only that single B-flat hanging in the air, Walter's eternal question, waiting for each person to provide their own answer. The work would continue. The 13 would grow, spreading to every city where veterans needed help. Richard Thompson would spend his remaining years teaching music to anyone who wanted to learn, finally understanding that wealth meant nothing compared to the richness of human connection. Sarah Hayes would ensure her grandfather's financial legacy continued to multiply, turning money into medicine, shelter, hope. Tommy Rodriguez would find and help thousands of homeless veterans, seeing his uncle's sacrifice renewed in each life saved. And Emily would carry Walter's notebook everywhere. A reminder that angels sometimes wear army jackets, that millionaires sometimes choose park benches, that the distance between mockery and respect is just one song played with enough truth to shatter false assumptions. The piano in the lobby would never be silent for long. There would always be someone approaching it hesitantly, reading the simple plaque, "Play Me," and deciding to risk being heard. Some would play professionally, others would pick out simple melodies with one finger, but all would be adding their voice to the endless requiem Walter had begun. Because that was Walter's true legacy, not the money, not the buildings, not even the thousands of lives saved, but the simple, revolutionary idea that everyone has music inside them worth playing. Everyone has a story worth hearing. Everyone has value that transcends their circumstances. In the end, Walter Hayes had asked to play for food and had fed 500 souls instead. He'd walked in as a beggar and revealed himself as a benefactor. He'd lived as a ghost and died as a legend. But most importantly, he'd shown that the distance between those who serve and those who need serving is an illusion, that we're all just humans trying to pay debts that can't be paid, save lives that can't be saved, play requiems that can't be finished. The B-flat hung in the air, waiting. And one by one people approached the pianos to answer it, each in their own way, each adding their voice to the eternal song of human beings, trying to lift each other up from the darkness. The ghost of Firebase Alpha had become 1,000 ghosts, each haunting the world, with compassion instead of fear, with music instead of silence, with love instead of indifference. And somewhere in whatever comes after this life, 13 soldiers and 1 pianist listened to the music they'd made possible, knowing that their sacrifice had not been in vain, that the requiem they'd begun would play on forever, a note, one life, one act of grace at a time.